I was on my way to buy laundry detergent when I saw him sitting on the sidewalk. And for a second I didn't recognize the man I once planned a future with. His coat was thin, his hands were shaking from the cold, and the cardboard sign beside him said he was trying to get back on his feet. Baby. When he looked up and our eyes met, my heart dropped to my stomach. I thought I had healed. I thought that chapter was closed. But what he told me next, sitting across from me in that little diner, broke me in a way I never expected. And you're not going to believe the truth he'd been carrying all this time, that I wasn't looking for him that day. I was looking for discounted laundry detergent and a little peace of mind. That's it. Just a regular afternoon with a regular to-do list. But life has a way of pulling old chapters off the shelf when you finally think you've moved on. And it was cold. The kind of cold that makes you walk faster and mind your business. And there he was, sitting against a brick wall, like the world had pressed pause on him. At first I didn't recognize him. The man I once loved used to carry himself like he had somewhere important to be. His shoes were always clean. His laugh came easy. His eyes held plans. But the man on that sidewalk looked folded in on himself. Coat too thin. Beard uneven. Hands rubbing together for warmth. And then he looked up. And my heart knew before my pride could pretend not to. And you ever see someone from your past and feel every version of yourself at once? The girl who loved him. The woman who left him. The one who healed. All of them standing there at the same time. And I walked over. I don't even remember deciding to. My feet just moved. And hey, I said softly. And he blinked like he thought I wasn't real. Then recognition settled in his eyes and something like shame tried to follow it. But I wouldn't let it. And we didn't hug. We didn't pretend this wasn't strange. I just asked if he'd eaten. He shrugged the way he always used to when he didn't want to admit he needed anything. And I told him to come with me. There was a diner around the corner. Warm lights. No judgment. And he hesitated. Pride has always been his heavy coat. Hard to take off even when it's weighing you down. But he came. And we sat in that booth like two people who once shared a life and now shared silence. When the food arrived, he ate slow. Careful. Like he was still trying to prove he had dignity. And I finally asked what happened. And he told me he lost his job not long after we broke up. Said he thought he'd recover quickly. He always believed he could outwork any setback. But rejection stacked up. Savings drained. Then his mother got sick. He chose hospital bills over rent. Chose her comfort over his security. And after she passed, he said he felt like he was floating without gravity. Eviction came. The car got taken. And every time he thought about calling me, he stopped himself. And that's when my chest tightened. And I didn't want you to see me like this, he said. You worked too hard to stop saving me. And baby. And do you know what it feels like to realize someone loved you enough to stay away? Not because they didn't care. But because they did. And he said he almost called so many times. Said losing me forced him to face himself without a safety net. Said he had to learn that love wasn't someone pulling him up every time he slipped. And I reached across the table and held his hand. Not as his woman. Not as his rescuer. Just as someone who once shared a heartbeat with him. And the truth he told me wasn't about losing money or losing a home. And it was that he was finally trying to find himself without leaning on anyone else to hold him steady. It was that he was finally trying to find himself without leaning on anyone else to hold him steady. And he told me sleeping outside stripped him down to nothing but his thoughts. No distractions. No image to protect. No relationship to hide inside. Just him and the truth he'd been running from for years. He said for the first time he couldn't blame timing or bad luck or even me. It was just him staring at the pieces of his own choices. And out there, he said quietly, you either face yourself or you disappear. And baby, the way he said it, not dramatic, not fishing for sympathy. Just honest. Like a man who had nothing left to perform. And I asked him if he was angry. Not at me. Not even at life. Just angry in general. Because sometimes when people fall that far, anger is the only thing keeping them warm. And he shook his head. And he admitted. But anger takes energy. And when you're trying to survive, you start choosing where your energy goes. And he told me there were nights he replayed our arguments in his head. The times I told him I felt alone even when he was standing right next to me. The times I asked him to open up and he changed the subject. He said back then he thought love meant being strong and silent. Providing. Protecting. Never admitting fear. But I see now, he said, I didn't know how to let you love me without feeling small. And that one right there, it settled deep. And because I remember feeling shut out. I remember begging for vulnerability and feeling like I was asking him to give me something he didn't even know how to name. And sitting across from him now, I realized it wasn't stubbornness. It was shame. It was a lifetime of being told that needing help meant failing as a man. And he looked at me and said, when we were together, I leaned on you so much that I stopped building my own legs. And there was no accusation in his voice. No manipulation. Just reflection. And for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to fix it. I didn't start calculating what I could do, who I could call, how I could rebuild him. I just listened. And do you know how powerful that is? To love someone once and then sit with them without trying to rescue them? And he told me he'd started going to free counseling sessions at a community center. Said it felt strange at first talking about things he'd buried since childhood. But he was tired of carrying invisible weight. Tired of confusing pride with strength. And I'm learning how to stand, he said. Even if it's slow. And we talked about growth. About how sometimes two people meet before they're ready to hold what they've been given. He admitted he didn't know how to be a partner back then. That he confused being needed with being loved. And when I started setting boundaries, he panicked because he didn't know who he was without someone compensating for his weaknesses. And I felt tears again, but not from sadness this time. From understanding. And because I wasn't perfect either. I had to admit that part of me liked being the strong one. The dependable one. It made me feel valuable. Necessary. And sometimes I ignored red flags because being needed felt like purpose. And we were two people loving from our wounds. And sitting there now, older, softer, wiser, I could see it clearly. And he told me he doesn't want pity. He doesn't even want redemption in my eyes. What he wants is to rebuild quietly. To get stable work. To earn his own place again. To look in the mirror and see a man he respects. And I don't expect us to be anything, he said gently. I just needed you to know that losing everything forced me to finally find myself. And the air between us shifted. Not romantic. Not heavy. Just real. And I realized something that night. And sometimes the greatest act of love isn't staying. It isn't going back. It isn't proving you can survive the storm together. And sometimes it's witnessing each other's transformation from a distance. And honoring the growth without reopening the old story. Sometimes it's witnessing each other's transformation from a distance. And honoring the growth without reopening the old story. And we stepped outside the diner and the air felt different. Not warmer, not softer, just clearer. Like something unspoken between us had finally found its voice. The streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows behind us. For a moment we stood there, not quite sure how to separate again after peeling back so many layers. And he adjusted that thin coat around his shoulders, and I noticed he still stood tall. Not in the old way, not in that polished, confident way that used to impress rooms. This was quieter. More grounded. Like a man who had been broken down to the foundation and was choosing to rebuild brick by brick. And I asked him what scared him the most right now. And he didn't hesitate. And going back to who I used to be. And not the homelessness. Not the uncertainty. Not even the rejection. It was the fear of repeating patterns. The fear of numbing himself with pride again. The fear of finding comfort in someone else's strength instead of cultivating his own. And that kind of self-awareness, it doesn't come easy. It costs something. And he told me there were nights on the streets when couples would walk past holding hands, laughing about something small and ordinary. And instead of feeling bitter, he felt regret. Not because he lost me specifically, but because he realized how little he understood what partnership really meant. And I thought love was about being admired, he said softly. I didn't realize it was about being accountable. And accountable. And that word hung in the air between us like a mirror. And I remembered the nights I cried quietly so I wouldn't bruise his ego. The times I swallowed my exhaustion because I thought patience would eventually fix everything. We both were performing roles we thought love required. And neither of us knew we were slowly suffocating. But here we were now. Not enemies. Not strangers. Just two people who once built something fragile and learned from its collapse. And he looked at me and smiled, not wide, not flashy, just gentle. "And you look lighter," he said. And I realized he was right. I wasn't carrying him anymore. I wasn't carrying resentment either. I was just standing in my own wholeness. And I had to learn that loving someone doesn't mean losing myself, I told him. And he nodded like that lesson made sense to him now in a way it never could before. And a bus roared past, wind rushing between us. And I thought about how easily life shifts. How one job loss, one illness, one season of grief can rearrange everything you thought was stable. It humbled me. Because if I'm honest, seeing him there reminded me that circumstances don't always reflect character. Sometimes they reflect timing, support systems, and the invisible battles people fight quietly. And he told me he's saving small amounts from day labor jobs. That he's on a waiting list for transitional housing. That he's learning to ask for help without feeling like he's surrendering his manhood. Each sentence felt like a stone placed carefully on a new foundation. And, "I'm not where I want to be," he admitted. "But I'm not who I used to be either." And that's growth. And we didn't exchange promises. We didn't talk about second chances. What we shared was deeper than that. It was recognition. It was gratitude for what we once were and respect for who we are becoming separately. And before we parted, he looked at me one more time, eyes steady. "And thank you for seeing me," he said. "And not saving. Not fixing. And seeing." And I realized sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone from your past isn't your heart again. And it's your compassion without conditions. It's your compassion without conditions. And baby, that kind of compassion doesn't come from weakness. It comes from healing. It comes from sitting with your own scars long enough that you stop bleeding on other people. Standing there under those streetlights, I realized how different this encounter would have been a few years ago. Back then I would have mistaken empathy for obligation. I would have called it fate. I would have packed up my boundaries and labeled it love. But growth changes your posture. And I asked him what he needed most right now, not as his past partner, but as a human being. He thought about it for a moment. Really thought about it. "And consistency," he said. "Even if it's just from myself." And that answer settled into me. Because consistency was the one thing we never mastered together. We were passionate, intense, hopeful. But steady? No. We were two storms trying to calm each other instead of learning how to rest. And he told me he wakes up early now even without an alarm. That he lines up at the same place every morning for work opportunities. That he keeps a small notebook where he writes down his goals. Not big dramatic dreams, just simple things. Shower regularly. Save $20. Apply to 3 jobs. Call the housing coordinator. And I used to think success had to look impressive, he said. Now I just want it to be stable. And I felt that in my chest. Because when we were together, everything was about potential. About what we could become. We talked about houses we couldn't afford yet. Vacations we hadn't earned. Businesses we hadn't built. We were always reaching forward, rarely tending to what was already fragile. And now he was focused on today. On the next right step. And there was a humility in him that hadn't been there before. Not humiliation. Not defeat. Just clarity. And I told him I was proud of him. And I meant it. Not in a romantic way. Not in a longing way. Just in the way you feel proud when someone chooses accountability over excuses. And he looked surprised by that. And I'm still embarrassed, he admitted. When people walk past, I wonder if they see a failure. And I shook my head gently. And some might, I said. But the ones who understand life will see a man rebuilding. And we stood in silence again, but this time it wasn't heavy. It felt like closure unfolding naturally instead of being forced. I realized I wasn't angry anymore about how things ended between us. I wasn't replaying arguments in my mind. I wasn't trying to rewrite history. I could hold both truths at once, that we loved each other deeply and that we were not healthy for each other at that time. And he told me something else before we separated. And when we broke up, I thought you were giving up on me, he said. Now I see you were giving me back to myself. And that right there, that's when my eyes filled again. And because walking away was the hardest thing I'd done back then. People think leaving means you stopped caring. They don't see the nights you question yourself. The guilt. The second guessing. The ache of choosing peace over familiarity. But hearing him say that made it clear. Sometimes love isn't about staying until everything collapses. Sometimes it's about stepping back so someone can face what only they can fix. And a car pulled up nearby, music thumping softly. The world kept moving around us like it always does. No dramatic soundtrack. No spotlight. Just two grown souls acknowledging how far they've come. And I reached into my bag and handed him a small card with a number for a community contact I trusted. Not as a lifeline to me, but as a bridge forward. And he accepted it carefully like it mattered. And as we finally turned to walk in opposite directions, I didn't feel that old tug in my chest. I felt peace. The kind that comes when you know the chapter closed exactly the way it needed to. And because sometimes you don't run into your past to reopen it. And sometimes you run into it to see how much you've both grown.